In this roundup of the week, is the war against plastic actually hurting the environment more than it's helping? Is Extinction Rebellion in turmoil over celebrity flying, as some mainstream papers are claiming? And do we need to be protected from pernicious gender stereotypes of women as CEOs of their own company? My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. It's been one of the highest profile environmental issues of recent years. Ever since people saw the images of the sheer awful, disgusting amount of plastic in the ocean in documentaries like Blue Planet 2. Now, according to a report by Green Alliance, the war against plastic packaging in stores, which has had a huge amount of momentum over the last couple of years, may be yet another campaign suffering from unintended consequences. Why? Simply because people are lurching towards simplistic responses to say that plastic is always bad and any responsible store has to get on with removing all of it from their shelves. Because whenever you lurch to simplistic solutions that inevitably turn out to be complex problems, then you end up running the risk that you do something that really doesn't help at all. As I say, over and over again on this channel, if you want to change the world for the better, you have to put in the work to come to the right conclusion about what actually needs to change. And being right is harder than you think. As H.L. Mencken once said, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. So let's look at this. What's not wrong is that there's a huge problem. According to a 2015 paper, 275 million metric tons of plastic waste were produced in 192 countries in 2010, with an estimated range of 4.8 million to 12.7 million ending up in the ocean, with an expectation that would increase. Obviously, that's a big range, reflecting the fact that even when you see video footage of people just openly emptying this rubbish into the waterways, they don't exactly go back and declare what they've just done and to what amount. That said, I don't think anyone's going to be quibbling with the range of quantities here. There's clearly a vast amount of trash in the ocean. Why did this issue take off in the way that it did? Yes, people were emotionally impacted when they saw the footage of plastic garbage floating in the ocean, catching or killing marine wildlife. But it particularly took hold because all of them see plastic around them every day when they step out of their home. According to surveys by Greenpeace and the Environmental Investigation Agency, UK supermarkets put more than 59 billion items of single-use plastic on the shelves every year, which is about 900 each for every individual in the UK. And a new plastics economy survey of members, which included many of the biggest plastics packaging producers, showed that only 3% of that packaging was designed for reuse. So in other words, a lot of it's going straight in the trash. So it was very easy for people to focus in on the things that they see in their everyday lives. And that's what they did in spades, which is why we've seen campaigns against plastic straws and plastic bags and plastic bottles, plastic food bags, plastic cutlery. There was even a campaign to ban the little plastic toys you get in Christmas crackers because of all the fish seen swimming around with their joke plastic moustaches. I'm going to catch hell for that last comment. The point is that people always care most about the things that feel personal to them. En masse, the public doesn't tend to go off and do research about why plastic is ending up in the oceans and what could be done to solve the problem. But if you tell them that to save the seahorses, you should get your local cafe to ban plastic straws or boycott cotton buds or whatever, well, now you're talking. And apparently the public have been definitely making their views known, and this has hit a lot of the retailers harder than they could have expected. One retailer who was quoted by the Green Alliance report said this: "It's been mostly complaints saying that plastic is evil and has no place, regardless of any positives it might have in addressing food waste and whatnot. It has been ferocious. We've seen an 800% uplift in customer queries in the last year alone." That sentiment hasn't necessarily been translating into changes in consumer behaviour, however. A number of the representatives said that concerns over plastic had not been evident in what people were actually buying. If you ask people what they do, a lot of them say they're avoiding single-use plastics. But if that was true, you would see evidence of it in aggregate human behaviour, and the retailers are saying that's simply not there. Not when it comes to consumers, anyway, the individuals. Some of the cafe brands and the other outlets that buy from them are apparently making the decision to ditch plastic full stop. A BRITA survey of 355 hospitality businesses in 2018 found that 61% were aiming to cut down on single-use plastic. But even without consumer behaviour driving it, public sentiment certainly is, and a lot of the stores are making decisions to switch away from plastics. According to the Green Alliance, many of them are doing this without doing a proper assessment of the environmental impact of the substitute materials they're turning to. They're canning plastic in the name of being environmentally friendly and potentially embracing alternatives that are worse or at least no better. Some supermarkets have switched from plastic food bags to single-use paper bags. The paper bags can have significantly higher carbon and other impacts. A study in Denmark, for instance, showed that a paper bag would have to be reused 43 times to have a lower environmental impact than a standard plastic bag. And this is part of the problem. Yes, there are some useless places where you get plastic, but mostly it's because it's a really useful material. The question isn't how do we get rid of plastic, like plastic is your great aunt who turned up to stay a month ago and won't take the hint to leave. The question is how do we prevent plastic waste in the ocean and elsewhere, and how do we reduce the impact of our economic activity on the environment overall? To answer the first of those, you have to ask the question, well, how's the plastic getting into the ocean in the first place? If I'm sitting in a Starbucks in Norwich and I use a plastic straw and hurl it, I don't just drop it, I contemptuously hurl it, because that's the kind of low life that I am, into the Starbucks bin. How does it get from there into the ocean? And the answer, of course, is that almost certainly it doesn't, but some of it certainly does. Researchers that have explored the question have identified that there are a number of countries that seem to be the main conduits for the majority of plastic waste getting into the ocean. These are located in Asia. China has historically been the biggest, along with Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam and Thailand. Well, what should we do with that information? We should look more deeply. It would be very easy simply to say, there you go, it's the Asians' fault. And partly that is true. Ultimately, the governments of those countries are in control of how they run their systems, how they enforce their laws, and how seriously such issues are taken. There's more to the story for sure, we'll get to that in a moment, but that doesn't absolve those countries of their responsibility. Everyone takes responsibility for their own actions. But it is also the case that a lot of the plastic found in the ocean is from the US and from the UK and from other places in Europe. So what gives? What gives is that many of the authorities who collect plastic waste in our countries with the stated aim of recycling it instead ship it to Asia, where it's meant to be recycled. But some don't ask too many questions about the traceability of that material and what happens to it. And we've seen plenty of footage from some of those countries showing that although a lot of it may be recycled, an awful lot of it isn't. It's either burnt, with some pretty major health impacts for people living all around the burning plastic, or it's simply dumped on land or into watercourses which end up in the ocean. As you probably already know, some of those countries have started to take action of their own. A couple of years ago, China refused to accept any additional waste from the West for recycling unless it met a stringent purity standard. That then meant that some of that waste was diverted instead to other countries, particularly but not exclusively Malaysia. Countries that are the least equipped to cope with such huge quantities of garbage are simply getting the remains of the Western throwaway society dumped on them. So ultimately, those doing the dumping bear a major part of responsibility for all of that as well. Unsurprisingly, some of those countries have started to kick back as well. Malaysia and the Philippines have both started sending unwanted waste back to its source. So if you want a campaign to stop your plastic waste ending up in the ocean, what makes the most sense? Complain to the retailers, tell the cafes not to use plastic straws, or find out if your local authority handles plastic waste properly, and if not, where it's sent. And if it's going abroad, hit them. I mean, that's the part of the system that deals with the quantity, and it's where decisions can be taken that prevent plastics from ending up in the ocean. There are local authorities that do use local facilities to properly recycle plastic waste. It's not as cheap as shipping off to Asia to be quietly dumped in the ocean, but at the end of the day, it's our rubbish and our responsibility. As for the retailers, push them to adopt net zero carbon targets and zero waste to landfill targets, and then let them sort out the best way to achieve those. Scrutinise their progress for sure. But the knee-jerk telling people that they have to be plastic free is actually not helping if we end up with things that are worse. Campaigners like Greenpeace are telling companies they have to move to only reusable packaging like glass bottles. But as the Green Alliance points out, glass takes energy to create and can be heavier to transport, all of which adds to its carbon emissions. There are times when it may be the best solution, but there are plenty of times when it's not. As Libby Peake, the author of the Green Alliance report, says, the public are right to be outraged about plastic pollution. But what we don't want is a few years down the line for them to be outraged about new environmental problems caused by the alternatives. Incidentally, I discussed the move away from plastic with Richard Walker, the managing director of Iceland Foods, for my podcast. Iceland Foods is one of those that is actively working to remove all plastic from their stores. And we had an interesting discussion about that along with their separate campaign on palm oil. You can see the video for that discussion on my channel. In other sort of maybe news, there's been a slightly strange story about Extinction Rebellion, with various mainstream papers like the Daily Telegraph and the Mail reporting that the group is in turmoil over comments by founder Roger Hallam that flying is really just beyond the pale, and the group ought to take a much stronger line to insist that people, including its celebrity backers, should stop flying. Now, this may sound familiar. Founder Roger Hallam says something controversial and the group ends up in turmoil. The thing that makes this odd is that these are all mainstream papers that tend to place a strict topicality criteria on the news that they report. But the podcast interviews that they're quoting were published midway through last year. Maybe something has happened to bring this to light and to create turmoil and furious debate within the group, as the papers report, but it's by no means obvious what that would be. As you may recall, Hallam is currently under orders to stay quiet while the campaign group tries to work out what to do over his previous controversial comments, where he told several German newspapers that the Holocaust was, just one of those things, or at least that's how it was interpreted. If you look to the public XR discussion channels, no one's talking about this, not even mention the fact the paper's been reporting about it. I guess your average Extinction Rebellion bod doesn't read the Daily Telegraph or the Mail, but even so, you'd expect there'd be some discussion if it was creating turmoil. It's the sort of thing that I would expect turmoil about. I mean, the two symbolic issues that standard environmentalists elevate above all others, regardless of all the other things that would be easier to tackle, that would make a bigger impact. No, it has to be flying and it has to be meat, because there are lifestyle issues. And ultimately, even when Extinction Rebellion's official position is they're not telling people how to live their lives, they kind of are. At the end of last year, they campaigned outside airports and outside a meat market. And in so doing, they managed to aggravate a lot of their target audience, which is exactly why they then get grief when their celebrity supporters fly in their first-class cabins to attend their demonstrations. Can they do better in 2020? They're working on their strategy, they've announced, because it's crucially important. In their recent release on the subject, they said, "The decisions made over the next 12 months will define the future of our world. The crisis is only getting worse. At the time of writing, Australia is on fire. Floods are destroying homes up and down the UK. And our precious biodiversity, the very systems that supply our food and vital resources, is collapsing." No, biodiversity isn't collapsing. Not to underestimate the pressure that the natural world is under, but it's not collapsing. We are hovering at the point of no return, and yet our government continues to pave the way for our extinction. So for all that we've seen climate scientists urging Extinction Rebellion to bring its rhetoric in line with the actual science, it still can't quite bring itself to do so. No, the government is not paving the way for human extinction. None of the reports published by the IPCC or any of the peer-reviewed journals say that because of climate change we are facing human extinction. Anyway, the point of all this is that the 2020 strategy is going to hinge on making specific demands on a local, regional and national level. And they give examples of what such demands might be. So, for instance, an immediate moratorium on airport expansion, an end to fossil fuel subsidies, a permanent ban on coal. So much more focused, granular goals than their previous big free demands. And that could be good. If they could smartly choose some strategically pivotal areas of focus, maybe particularly those where the government would have to take action to deliver its own promises on net zero by 2050, but seems cautious to do so, that could actually be useful. Could be that I stop being snarky about Extinction Rebellion and give it at least half a nudge of support. If it stopped telling children they're going to die young and stuck to the IPCC science, and if it campaigned in a way designed to win support rather than alienate it, which all seems pretty unlikely because the process of deciding what their focus is going to be for 2020 is going to come basically from internal polling. And that will therefore default to the campaigners' favourite bugbears, which will not be proportionate, it will not be strategic, it'll just be the things that get their goat. Maybe that's why they're rumoured to be arguing about flying, I might be wrong. They say that their next big rebellion will be in the summer, although they're consulting about the exact date, but they promise it's going to be a mass mobilisation of ordinary people across the country. Define ordinary in this context. Will they be here? Will it be hippies wearing suits, or is it just wishful thinking? Now, ordinary people would be good. Removing the barriers between you and your audience is a key part of persuasion. But that's not just about putting ordinary people on the streets to blockade airports, even if ordinary people were inclined to do such a thing. You need an active problem-solving strategy of a sort that generally doesn't spring from leaderless movements like this one. I suspect that they know they face a real challenge with the next big action because the last one was not a great success. If the next one has noticeably fewer people involved or similarly goes off the rails, everyone's kind of going to see that they passed their peak. And that's the end of it. Draining momentum, they'll continue to make a noise on a regular basis, but the logic behind their strategy was that movement was going to grow until it reached the point where it became irresistible and bent the government to their will by force of numbers. Even their own people are not happy with the recent activities of the main group. For instance, Portsmouth Extinction Rebellion told their local press that the actions of a national group had hurt their local campaign. Selma Heimerdinger said, "The things the main Extinction Rebellion group does can make us unpopular with some people." The local paper went on, "Looking ahead to the new year, Portsmouth's Extinction Rebellion campaigners are optimistic about the way the city will approach climate change. We work very closely with Portsmouth City Council and Stephen Morgan is really supportive of us," she said. "We found that cooperating with the council has worked better than trying to be disruptive." Who'd have thought it? Working in partnership with people who have the same stake in the future as you do might be even better than stopping them from going to work in the morning. I mean, nobody would have thought to predict that in the early days. Definitely nobody would have made any videos pointing out something so incredibly complicated and unintuitive. All right. I didn't think I was starting 2020 in such a snarky frame of mind, but I just see all of it gradually unravelling from here. Don't think it's going to be pretty. Let's quickly do one thing I like and one thing that I don't. For one thing that I like this week, slightly self-referential, for which I apologise, but I've been overwhelmed by just how triggered I managed to make so many people in my last video about CO2 and climate change, where I dismissed some of the all caps comments that I get on this channel about CO2 is plant food. Goodness me. It's like I persuaded a significant proportion of the audience that I was personally insulting their grandmother. What I said, of course, was that the argument was a red herring. I used the analogy of drowning. If you're drowning in water, the fact that water is factually correctly essential for life is not a relevant factor in that immediate context. The point that a red herring is something that is factually correct but irrelevant to the discussion at hand did not seem to come across to people for whom this is a killer argument. I had no end of people saying things like, "But CO2 is plant food." I know. It matters not one jot to the discussion about its role as a greenhouse gas. The benefit of the one doesn't outweigh the disbenefit of the other. And if your position is that there is no disbenefit, because for whatever reason you think the greenhouse effect isn't real, then it's that is the focus of the disagreement and hence your argument. The side benefit of CO2 is not the relevant point. Even as I'm saying this, I know it's not going to make the slightest difference, and I'm just letting myself in for a whole bunch more scolding, so have at it. By the way, with this video, the number of comments truly hit the sort of numbers that meant I couldn't respond as much as I would have liked. In 2.5 days, it's had 900 comments. And at that point, I have to say that I either focus on making videos or responding to hundreds of comments. So apologies to those who posted thoughtful comments and I haven't had the time to get to them. I do try to read them, and some of the most interesting ones I copy and paste in the hope that I might get to look at more detail at their points in the future. And finally, the thing that I don't like. The UK Advertising Standards Authority has struck again on the nanny state quest to protect us, the hapless British public, from gender stereotypes. Having already protected us from the men eating Philadelphia cheese and a woman sitting in a park reading a book next to a pram, it has now moved to protect us from this advert for a firm of tech freelancers. The woman in the image is meant to be the chief executive of her own company. Obviously, that's such a classic negative stereotype. Women entrepreneurs. It's drawing inspiration from this New York Times best-selling book, #Girlboss, written by, yes indeed, the woman CEO of an energetic company, Sophia Amoruso. It's created enough of a phenomenon that Money magazine had her on the front cover, the #Girlboss revolution, and it's also referred to on edgier magazines like this one from Naked magazine. I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce that. Exclusive, meet our girl boss. Indeed, it's such a phenomenon that we had a Girl Boss Netflix series. By all accounts, a terrible Netflix series that was cancelled after one season, but a series nonetheless, called Girl Boss. A Twitter search on #GirlBoss sees lots of positive tweets about it, using it as an endorsement motivational hashtag. So how the heck did this advert, run by the company People Per Hour, fall foul of the ASA's ridiculous gender stereotype ban? Apparently, it reinforced harmful gender stereotypes. Why? Because it uses the word girl. I kid you not. This is a book, a look, and even a terrible Netflix show. But to use the phrase in advertising is demeaning to women. The company removed the word girl from the ad and issued an apology. All the time I imagine thinking, what the heck just happened here? You know, if you don't like the tone or pitch of an advert, that's absolutely fine. You don't have to buy from that company if its advertising slogan bugs you. But in what universe does the regulator, by extension the state, think that it should be protecting us from an advert like this? How many young girls saw that picture of a woman CEO and thought, well, I wouldn't demean myself to become a CEO if someone's going to call me a girl boss? If you can't show a woman as the chief executive, a role that's not even remotely a gender stereotype, what kind of politically correct fantasy nightmare have we actually wandered into? Now, look, you may hate that advert, and that's fine. Hate it if you like. You may feel it's slightly demeaning if you weren't aware of the girl boss phenomenon, or even if you were. It's not the point. Do we really need it to be banned? Surely not. Anyway, that's my thoughts. Add your own in the comments below. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.